Okay. Are we on? Let's see how we're doing over here. Yeah, good. Okay. How's everybody doing? Good, good, good. Okay, it's been a while since I've been talking with you and chatting, and I thought it was time to get into this because let me tell you, my question was, do you want me to give the good news or the bad news first? Well, let me tell you, there isn't really any good news about what's happening. And if you've been paying attention, what I'm trying to do is basically translate stuff for you, events that are occurring, so that you can better prepare for what's happening and for what is coming. And what is coming is going to be, as I describe it, hell on wheels. So what is coming? Or let's the way I'm going to get going with this is I'm going to give you a little history lesson, okay? And what I've done is I've put this little presentation together. And pardon, you'll hear my chickens going off. I got my roosters going off, and my geese out the other side will probably be cackling too. But yeah, let's get with the flow, because right now there's going to be some heavy-duty, interesting, mind-blowing stuff. And as I talk about what is occurring, let me tell you, the reason it's taken me a while to get on with this is that it's depressing. I mean, it is really depressing. Last time I had this kind of depression was for about 2 weeks, and it's because I read not The Naked Communist, but I read The Naked Capitalist. And basically, I had been working in Silicon Valley. Actually, I actually left Silicon Valley. But when I came back from Central America, after I did my 5 years in the war down there, I got into, I went back to school, a returning adult student at San Francisco State, and then became a technical writer. I worked in Silicon Valley as a technical writer, and hey, I hear my geese going up. Worked as a technical writer in Silicon Valley. Made damn good money. I mean, everybody was making good money, and it's kind of interesting because I was asking questions about, like, why are we making so much money, but I don't see us actually producing anything? That's the interesting thing about Silicon Valley. They get a lot of venture capitalists who put a lot of money into things, but then you kind of wonder, like, where's the money going and what's the money producing? And that's the big interesting thing about why and where and how we are right now. Because there's been a lot of money going and flowing, and you kind of ask, what is the difference between what's happening now and, let's say, what happened right after World War II? And that's the history lesson I'll be giving you. But let me tell you, if you get a chance, go to Amazon. I'll have links. Hopefully you're tracking me on YouTube also, because I can't really put, if you're on Facebook only, you won't be able to follow the links. But you got to go over and please subscribe. Like and subscribe my videos and all my prior videos if you haven't seen them, prior episodes. This is episode 24. And this one, of course, is The Fourth Turning and the Perfect Storm. And this will be part 1. I'm trying to keep this at a reasonable time because we keep on going up. And I did an hour and 15 minutes last time, so I'm going to try and keep this at about an hour. And then we'll do part 2. Now, basically, as we go in through part 1, it'll basically set you up for why we're where we're at now. And give you an idea of where I personally forecast where we're going to be after this is all done. And what we're in right now is called the crisis. The crisis is basically a 20-year period. And I'm also reading another book by George Friedman, and hopefully I'll actually get an interview with George Friedman. I'd love to talk with him for an hour and talk about his new book, which is titled The Crisis Before the Calm. Which it's interesting in his book, what he does is he breaks it into 2 different parameters. One is the institutional changes, and the other one is the economic changes. In this book, The Fourth Turning by Howe and Strauss, I'll have links at the bottom of the comment and in the description at YouTube. So please, again, go over to YouTube, like and subscribe to my channel, Treasure Quest Snake Island, The Real Story. And you may notice that originally this channel was designed in order to get the word out about the criminality and fraud that occurs in the reality TV industry that tries to hide under the cloak of, quote, documentary, or as David Zasloff likes to call it, the CEO of Discovery Corporation, true life documentary, which is pretty bizarre. But because there is no documentary and there is no true life, other than what they do is they snucker you into being on the show, and then you sign a non-disclosure that in actuality, when criminal activity is occurring on set, it's not binding. And so that's actually why I got into writing the book, which is my reality TV industry book, which is actually more pertinent now as you look at all the news events that are being used strictly as propaganda, depending on which side you're listening to, in terms of who was the broadcaster and who was the channel. And that's pretty sad, because there was a time, especially when I started as a journalist, and I started off to go at the age of 18 to go and be a combat photographer in Cambodia, Laos, Thailand in 1983, and ended up in prison for 11 months. And if you don't know that story, you definitely got to read my other book, The Bamboo Chest, which is actually the reason that I got on the TV show Treasure Quest Snake Island. So let's get back to this, because man, it's going to be a freaking rodeo ride. The Fourth Turning and the Perfect Storm. So going back, get a copy of The Naked Communist and The Naked Capitalist by Cleon Skousen. The reason I highly recommend The Naked Capitalist is because I read it, as I say, 20 years ago, and the book had come out in the early 70s. And what Skousen had described in The Naked Capitalist, he described as a forecast. And it's interesting when you pick up a book that talks about things, well, this happened because of this and that happened because of that. But when you see a book that not only goes into past events like the October Revolution in Russia, the February Revolution, that was the earlier one, and that was part of this whole change where they had a proxy government or a interim government, and people don't realize that the way the communists work is what they do is they come in with the revolutionaries, and this is something they've learned very well, is they come in just like the Bolsheviks did, and the Maoists did. They'll come in with other revolutionaries, because you'll notice that, like in the United States, people are not very happy with the way the things are going on in the country. And I'm not just talking about in this country, also Brazil, other countries, South America, Asia, and actually it'll be really interesting to see what happens in China as things get worse economically. And it's going to get worse economically. But the communists are really good at coming in, fighting alongside other revolutionaries, fighting for freedom, etc., or an improved life. And then what happens is, once they kick out the prior government, for instance, in Russia, it was the Tsarist control. When Nicholas abdicated and basically says, you know, I do not want to rule anymore, and then you had the interim government, and then after that you had the October Revolution in St. Petersburg, and then that's actually where the Bolsheviks brought the capital of Russia to Moscow. And in Russia, that is what began the setup for the rest of the world. And what we're seeing here in the United States is we're seeing a renewed attempt at changing government, using the Democrats the Democratic Party in order to work their ways. Once they change it, then they'll take over. That's how they work. They did it in Nicaragua. They tried to do it in El Salvador. We were very successful in beating them. And then what they ended up doing is they came in, they took power by financial support from Fidel Castro, the same thing that Lula did in Brazil. Who's that idiot? Correa, in my mother's country of Ecuador. And Chavez in Venezuela. These were all backed by Castro, the Castro brothers. And that's the thing I've talked about. So it's like, you know, when Raul Castro came into power, all these journalists were saying, well, what's Raul all like? You know, what's he really like? Or what's he going to be like? You know, he's going to take power from his brother. Well, for those of us fought him and his muchachos in El Salvador during the war and in Nicaragua, he was always the zealot. As a matter of fact, when you talk about the ideologues, it was Raul and Che Guevara who actually had a meeting of minds. It wasn't really Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. And the reason is because Fidel Castro was always just somebody who wanted power, and he wanted power in his own place. He just wanted to be the top king, and he got it. And he was able to play the different powers of the world in order to achieve his ends. And then later he realized that, hey, to keep this going, I had to. Hey, Murph, good to see you, man. You're alive. Anyway, so get ready. This is going to be a wild ride because a lot of things are happening. There's the economics aspect of it. There's the geopolitical. There's the national political. And there is going to be some very interesting events to be coming up soon that you need to be aware of. And basically, it's kind of like a retro experience. But see, a lot of people are talking about it saying that, oh, this is like the 60s. No, it's not like the 60s. It's like the 1930s. And we'll talk about that in the crises. That's not what we're going to be talking about in this part. So the parts that we're going to be talking about, again, I'm going to go back to talking about this Naked Capitalist. Read the Naked Capitalist. For those of you who fought communism at the time that I fought communism and you thought we were kicking ass and doing things, when you read the Naked Capitalist, you'll see, maybe I should have just stayed at UC Berkeley, got my commission in the Navy, and flown F-18s that were just coming out at that time. Because I was a midshipman. And a lot of people don't know that. Even DIA didn't know that when I came back and was released and I was debriefed at the Pentagon that I was actually a U.S. Navy midshipman with a Marine option. I was actually going to be a Marine pilot. But I got sucked up into this whole new world. So, let's talk a little bit about that whole new world in the unraveling. That's when we get from 84 until 2000. Right now, we're going to talk about 1946 to 1964. And listen to that record. And then we'll listen to the other record, which will be from 1964 until 1984. Those are going to be some very interesting years. And those first 20 are called the high in the book, The Fourth Turning. And the second part is called the awakening. And that's where people find themselves in the hippie movements and the belly observation of the 60s at Berkeley, which is really interesting because by the time I was at Berkeley, just about everybody was going to Berkeley, was especially in the engineering department, because I was going to be an electrical engineer, just like my dad. And get my commission and fly for United, and after I got out of the Navy, and then I'd probably start my own Silicon Valley software company. Be a billionaire by now, right? Yeah, okay. So, Naked Capitalist, read that book. It'll tell you who pays for everything, how things play. And remember, when Skousen, he's dead now, and I think his son is actually promoting the book, etc. But when Cleon Skousen wrote that book, The Naked Capitalist, he was writing about things from the past and how those things have affected the present and the future. And that future is coming down. It's coming down hard. But I don't think he was ready for what was going to happen or what is going to happen. And as we talk further, you're going to see reasons of why people aren't calling me, even though I've attempted being on different shows to talk about what I've learned and what I've studied, and talking about it from a real life experience. Because as I've been studying other guys on the internet, especially on YouTube, I see a lot of professors talking from the White Castle of the institution. And that's the issue. That's the problem. Even when they go off into the other parts of the world, they're still part of the institution. They have never really let go and actually delved into what it's like for those who are dealing with what we're dealing with now and what we're going to be dealing with in the future. And that's why they can't understand why we're having, quote, illogical responses to what is happening. So, let's go over and take a look at, oh, and remember, again, subscribe at YouTube, like and share over there. It's going to be the surest way for you to get info. And also, in order to help you get going on this, because you got to get your own action plan. Let me tell you, my action plan started 8 years ago. It actually started, let's see, yeah, dang. It's like 9 years ago. That's when I came back from Korea. I was working in Korea. I was an instructor for the military intelligence school in Seoul, in Jamsil. And I'd gone over there because I wanted to learn Korean. I wanted to get deep into the Korean culture, because when I was a paramilitary officer, I was trained in Hwarangdo, and Hwarangdo has a very interesting history, even though everybody automatically, when you think about Korean martial arts, you think about Taekwondo. That's because Taekwondo had a better marketer. Hwarangdo, though, has a very interesting cultural link to ancient Korea, which is really cool. So if you'd like to check out Hwarangdo, type in HWARANG-DO, Hwarangdo. So check that out if you'd like to. But anyway, my experiences with Hwarangdo and with Koreans at that time in my life led me to want to go back to, or go to Korea and take this contract. And that's where I went, and I worked on it, and then I came back. And when I came back, I watched a show, I watched a channel, Peak Prosperity by Chris Martinson. And at that time, he was talking about economic collapse. And actually, that's what's happening right now. But who knew that it was going to happen so rapidly, or actually have the tipping point of the COVID or the CCP virus, the COVID-19. And that would be it, because think about that. Something that took 3 years, from 1929 until 1932, to reach the level of unemployment that we have in this country right now, took only 1 month. Think about that. Look at that graph. It's going to be a mind blower. So let's get into it. And so what happened? So let's look at this. The Roaring 20s, the good times. And that was the unraveling of the previous 80-year cycle, because what the fourth turning talks about, it talks about 80-year cycles of a nation, well, specifically in the United States. Other countries, they say it's a seculum, a 100-year cycle. Howe and Strauss, they broke it down to an 80-year cycle. And if you go into what George Friedman says in his book, The Crisis Before the Storm, the Calm, he describes it as an 80-year cycle for the institution and I think it's a 50-year cycle for the economics of a country, right? Meaning like going through like an agricultural economy, an agricultural society, to an industrial society. And actually, this is the thing about it, it's really interesting. If you talk about and think about it, we'll talk about that in the next, and that'll be in the unraveling, is we talk about how we have become a service society in the United States. We used to be industrial, but when we moved everything over to China, that flipped over everything around. So we don't really produce things in this country in the manner that we used to, because it's all being done by China. And it's being done because of employment. And on a really dark level, it's based on the idea of slavery. So Nike and Microsoft and Apple, all these companies have benefited by a form of slavery in China. And think about that. Think about it also on a much deeper level of why Gates, and if Steve Jobs was still alive, he'd probably be jumping on the bandwagon. Oh, we got to, like, kumbaya together and be friends with China. And I'm thinking, no, China has been using that against us and the rest of the free world because of what their intentions are. So here we are in the Roaring 20s. Okay, that's still under the unraveling. It was a great time, right? Parties and everybody's having fun. We have flappers, the styles, in an industry making vehicles, production. Here's some family pics. This is my family. This is the Graham family, right? So this one right here, this is my great-grandfather. I never met him because he died in the 50s. But now this woman right here in front of the, I think it's a Model T. No, it's not Model T. It's a later model of, I think it's a Ford. That's my great-grandmother. And I met my great-grandmother. It's amazing. She was born in the 1800s. And I met her in the 70s, in the early 70s when I was a little kid. And we went to her old folks home, and she was staying there, elderly care. Beautiful woman, very nice woman. And to think that she'd gone through such historical events in the United States. And here's this car. I mean, they're doing well. This is the 1920s, and you can tell also by the hat. The hat that my great-grandfather is wearing right there. And you also see that he's also right here in the back. That's my great-grandfather also back in there. So, and they had an auto repair, and this is in Spokane, Washington, back in the 20s. And they had a repair, and they had an auto dealer dealership. This was in Spokane, Washington in the 1920s. Doing really well. And then what happened? This is now. And the reason we're not aware of this is we got something called Social Security. We got Social Security, we have unemployment insurance, we have the FDIC that's supposed to protect our money in the banks, right? Yeah. What is money? We'll talk about that. But if you believe in fiat currency, let me tell you what money is not. Real money, real wealth, real cash. It's not the paper money that you have in your pocket. It's not the numbers that you have in your bank account. Real wealth, financial wealth, are tangibles. That's gold, that's silver, that's real estate. And when we start talking about real estate, and I'm hoping you can get to it, that's the reason I moved back to Alaska. Why did I move back to Alaska when I knew there was going to be an economic collapse? Again, I didn't know it was going to be because of some bioweapon from China, from the CCP. It was... We got a comment here. Let me look at this one. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's going to be decrease. You're right, Murph. Damn, man. Yeah, it's going to continue from the west. The west is going to be decreasing the funding to the Chinese. So they kind of like shot themselves in the foot. But here's what happened. We've already been on this road. Remember, there is the reason and the cause, but then there's what would be the tipping point. So the tipping point is actually what gets the ball rolling. But think about it this way, is you have everything set up for it to roll. And that's what I'm going to be talking about in terms of how things were set up. So I'd like you to get into your minds, get this into your minds, that everything that we're on right now was set up between 1946 and 1964. The way I like to describe it, and you'll see that tomorrow, is that we're on a train, okay? So we're all on this train. The whole world is on this train because it's all global now. You can't just say it's the United States because by the actions that were created between 46 and 64 and the United Nations and international business, and we'll talk about that because I have a very close relationship to that because my father was a sales engineer and then he became a director. And my father was part of this big high. He started, okay, let's say he was part of the silent generation. That was the generation that was not old enough to go to World War II, but definitely old enough to do Korea. And there's a very interesting relationship between the GI generation and the Korean War generation. It's kind of like, well, you know, you guys were in Afghanistan, but were you in Vietnam? It's that kind of like mentality. You know, or like for me, it's like, well, yeah, you were in Central America. Like, but what was Central America? Yeah, we'll talk about that in the next episode. Because there is so many people who write history books, they have no freaking idea what Central America was. As I like to tell you, and I'll continue to say, if we didn't win the war in Central America, we'd all be speaking, because everybody say, you know, back in the Cold War, said, oh yeah, you know, if we lost the war against the Soviets, we'd be speaking Russian, right? No, we wouldn't be speaking Russian. We'd be speaking Cuban Spanish. ¿Entiendes? Okay. So, what happened is that the tracks were laid from 1946 until 1964. After the last crises. So the last crises in this 80-year cycle, or this 80-year evolutionary cycle, and continuing cycles, is the last crisis was from 1929 until 1945, okay? So it starts off with the economics, the Great Depression, the stock crash. And this is the thing, don't trust all this stuff about, oh, well, you know, the stocks are just they're doing great. We got like, you know, another rally. You know, it's going to be a bull market again. Same thing happened at the beginning of the Great Depression. There was a rally. And it's this attempt by the market to like, come on, get in, let's get in. We can just push it. If we push hard enough, This is going to get better, and all the bad stuff will go away. But see, this is the thing about it. This is the preservationist attitude that we humans have. We don't, when we have an enjoyable experience, we want that good experience to continue, right? We're programmed to be like that. The key is that the natural world does not run that way. That's why we have birth, we have life, and then we have death. And then we have actual life coming from that death, right? You need that death in order to have the next life. So here we have a situation where we are going to a death of this 80-year cycle. And the question is, what's going to appear on the other side? So in contrast to other people who think, oh my God, it's going to be this big apocalyptic experience. And I see guys, prepping and getting ready for like, oh yeah, we're going to survive, because they read a lot of those books from the 70s, right? Like those Mac Dolan and all those survivor magazines and survivor novels about how we're going to get through the post-apocalyptic experience, and we're going to be all nomads moving around. It's like people who romanticize like Jeremiah Johnson, and they think, oh yeah, I want to be a mountain man. I want to go and live in the woods and live by myself and be in the woods as a mountain man, all by myself, right? But then when you actually study the history, you realize that the people who survive this are going to be the people who actually, and thrive from this, are going to be the people who unify and connect in community. And that's what's really important. This is to understand community and how you need to bond with your community and get with that community, okay? So, you don't want to be like the lone mountain man getting ready for some big apocalypse, because you're going to get wiped out, okay? That's just what happened. That's what happened to these mountain men. The ones who survived and did well, Kit Carson, Jeremiah Johnson, well, it was Liver Eaton Johnson. Excuse me. They survived and they did well because, like Jeremiah Johnson, I mean, he did lose his wife, and that's what led to him going and eating crow liver and killing about a lot of crow. I think it was crow. Excuse me. Is that he married into the tribe. He got into the community. He also learned skills from that community. So they taught him how to be a good woodsman and a mountain man and a trapper and all this kind of stuff. So what's really important as you get ready for this, you're getting ready for this and you're continuing on this, is to continue and look at this and see how it's really important to be part of your community, build up your community, and look at where we're going to be going, and also look at where the economy is going. So remember, the creation of this country, agrarian, that was at the beginning of the first 80-year cycle, during the big high of that, which was right after the American Revolution. We were agrarian, right? Then we go from agrarian to just before the Civil War, but then after the Civil War, boom, the big high, we become extremely industrial, and we become the major producers for the world. Then after that, we get to the and that industrial age actually went all the way until the 1980s. Remember that. By the time we get to the 1980s and we start moving away from even producing our own computers, where we have to go to Japan, we go to China for cheaper production, and then we start moving towards creating software, and we become a service-oriented. Remember, it moves west. Everything is moving west around the world in a circular. So it's like everything that was happening in the UK, in England, Great Britain, it started moving our way. So just like Britain was ag, it moved over. The Americas became ag, industrial. And then as the UK became industrial, it then flipped over to the United States. And then as the UK, like right about just before the Civil War, or right about the beginning of the Civil War, we then began to move over to the next one, right? So this is what is really important to understand is we're in this point right now where it's really, really important for you to look at how our cycle, and I have a forecast that I think we're actually, because of how people are, I mean, you look at the prices of McDonald's. Look at the prices of McDonald's. I mean, shoot, within like the last year, we've seen a price that's actually increased from starting off as just a what is it, is like what you can pay, what, $6 $7 for like a meal, and now we're like at $9. You know, like every 2 weeks I stop by McDonald's just to make sure that I look at it, see what's happening, look at the price, see if that's going anywhere, and you notice the price keeps on going up. So that's the key about what is really happening, is that we're going to see increases in prices, and we're going to see more on how that is going to be affecting your lifestyle and basically how and where you're living, right? So what happened? Food lines. I mean, think about that. We've already got food lines occurring right now in the cities because a lot of people aren't working. This is the same evolution. Remember, there's nothing new in history. Everything is continuing to go. So we go from that, and here's something that I'm really concerned with that we really have to look at, and that is the idea that as they're spending money, as you see more and more of this spending in order to cover people's expenses, it is going to get really bad, right? So we've got this situation where we could possibly end up like Germany. I mean, look at that. Look at that woman. She's burning Deutschmarks. She's burning Deutschmarks because there's more value in the kelvins, in getting the heat out of that piece of paper, than it is the actual value, the monetary value that fiat currency is supposed to, let me turn that off, that is supposed to be declared by that paper note, right? So that's the thing about fiat currency. Understanding fiat currency. Fiat currency is basically the is a note that covers what is supposed to be in the bank or available to you that you have earned through your labor, right? So Zimbabwe, that's like the most modern that we've had in that experience. But if you go and look at that, 100 Milliarden, I think that's what, a trillion? That's a trillion Deutschmark. And that's on one bill. And the Germans, this was in the 1920s, 1923, were rolling wheelbarrows full of it, full of that, all the way to their homes in order to burn it, right? So this is the thing about what I'm trying to get across is, you know, don't be distracted by the small pictures. And so what are the small pictures that are occurring during this evolution? One is China, the COVID, Middle East this morning. There was a attack by the Israelis. The Air Force just bombed an ammo dump in Beirut. And if you're looking at the videos that are flying around, that's what happened. A friend of mine who was actually a Christian guerrilla in the war in Beirut back in the during the 80s, early 80s, and he. His family's there, and his sister basically saw the two jets fly over and shot missiles into that warehouse on the docks, and that's what lit it up. Looks like an atomic explosion, right? Well, it's just a bunch of TNT and a bunch of other explosives. But Middle East, then we've got the economy. We've got all these things happening, and these are the issues that we have, is that we have got to be really attentive to what is the big picture. And the big picture is this evolution that's occurring with the generational turns. And it's actually generational. This is the thing about it. Is as a generation lives and experiences life and comes up with ideas and takes over the governments and the institutions and the economics, and then it revolves and evolves. This all then gets over and gets put into these new evolutions and these newer cycles. And as they change, they gain speed. So the speed we're getting into right now and continue to go through is basically this crisis. And this crisis, and I have to state it, is a total reset. And that's what it's going to be. It's going to be an institutional, it's going to be an economic. And because we have been working in a global environment since definitely the 60s, this global environment in terms of our economics, and then amplified politically through the UN, is going to affect everywhere. And you're seeing this in other countries. You see this in Germany. Germany right now is freaking on an implode. Where even they're fed up with Merkel and the rest of the government telling them what to do with regards to COVID and not being able to go and do things, right? So let's go look at these 4 turnings. So the first turning, that's the high. That's 1946. In this last evolution is 1946 to 1964. It's an upbeat era of strengthening institutions and weakening individualism when a new civic order implants and the old values regime decays. Then we get to the second turning. Okay, now that was 64 until 84. And that's kind of like the summer. And kind of like, the summer of love in the 60s in San Francisco. Well, that was a passionate era of spiritual upheaval when the civic order comes under attack from a new values regime. Now, after that, we get into when I actually was becoming a young man, which is the 80s, and that's in 84 to 2004. And that's the third turning. That's during the Reagan administration. So the Reagan administration until the Bush administration, it's a downcast era of strengthening individualism, the unraveling, the fall, and I call it the fall especially, and individualism and weakening institutions when the old civic order decays and the new values regime implants. And remember, this is the new regime and it's an ideology. And this ideology and the manner in which it moves is really important, because all these things that are happening right now really started to get their wheels. Think about it. Where was de Blasio? De Blasio and Bernie Sanders, where were they? Same time I was fighting communists in Central America? Oh, they were in the cities hanging out with the Sandinistas and hanging out with the FMLN. So they're hanging out with the communists, and so now they're older and they've realized, well, I can't fight in the jungles alongside these guys, but I can definitely get into a position of power and achieve the things I never could have by fighting in the jungle, right? Like lessons learned from Fidel Castro in Brazil, with Lula, and with Ortega in Nicaragua. Because remember, how in the world can you have Ortega get kicked out because of all the things that he pulled as a Sandinista? Then he comes back in, just like with the FMLN. They brought the FMLN, but that was a new event. They voted in the FMLN, thinking the FMLN was somehow going to make things different, right? Well, yeah, it made it different, all right, but not in a good way. Unless you're of those elite, the 1%. Yeah, then it's great for you, because you've got all the money, you got all the power, and you can pay whoever you want to be, because want to be in power. Because remember, people in power, politicians, do not have power. They are spokespeople. And I hate to say this, even Trump, the office of the president is not as powerful as you might want to or think that it is. Okay, it never has been, especially in this country. Thank God it was actually designed that way. It's really interesting when you look at what the founding fathers were trying to design. It was actually a government that did not work efficiently, because they knew that when a government works efficiently, it becomes a tyranny, right? Think about that. Okay, so then the fourth turning. Let's get into the fourth turning and the crisis, the reset, the winter. That's where we are right now. And for those of us who actually prepared, but it's kind of, it's a long preparation, right? Because if we're talking about the summer, which is when you're like planting and continuing to do what you were doing in the spring, and you go into summer, and then you're just, keeping your crops going and making sure everything's going well. And then the fall, you're supposed to be like, harvesting your crop and getting ready for winter. But here we are in winter already, and it's going to be catch up for a lot of people. So we'll be talking in the part 2. We'll also be talking about the fourth turning. So the fourth turning is going to be the crisis reset, and that's going to be winter. It's going to be the decisive era of secular upheaval when the values regime propels the replacement of the old civic order with a new one. You got to get ready for that one. I hope you're ready for that one. I hope I'm ready for this one. Yeah. And then added on to that, we're going to talk about some interesting environmental stuff. And that's what I call the perfect storm. But if you ever want to go and read about something really interesting, go and read about grand solar minimums, because grand solar minimums, they're very, very, very interesting. Because let me tell you, when you throw everything else that's happening, politically, economically, financially, and then you throw in our food sources and a variation of degrees. Did you know it only takes 1 to 2 degrees variation globally in order for, or in an area, in order for the crops to just fail? Something to think about. Okay, so let's get to some other bright stuff. So here we are, spring. Let's talk about the season. So let's translate it, because, you know, I'm a homesteader. And I got my plot all planted out. I got my beehives are out there. The little bees are working their way, making honey. I've got plants growing. You know, I've got the apple trees out. You know, it's probably gonna be another year, but we're gonna definitely get some high tunnels in here, because without the high tunnels, let me tell you, it's gonna be a harsh coming growing seasons over the next few years with this perfect storm coming. And what else? Oh, yeah, I got chickens talked about. You can hear them, and then we got the you can hear the roosters, and then we got the geese. But it's a seasonal thing, and this is the thing about the season of a nation, and that's where we're at right now. And that is, you know, it's spring. So we were talking about the high. That was the high. That was the land rebirthing. You know, plant life, the budding, blossoming, disking. That's when you start tearing up the land, planting your seeds, bucking, and that's when I start, you know, bucking and splitting the wood that I cut in the winter, right? I pull the logs out in the winter on the ice because it's easier to just slide them on there. And this is also, you know, when there's going to be some major profound change. It's going to be like, you know, the spring is going to decide what the fall and summer are going to be like, right? Or we use it as an indicator, like, hopefully, you know, can we be ready for this, or how are we going to go with this, right? So then we get to summer. And we get into the watering, the nurturing, the hoeing, the trimming, summer and the harvest. That's when I'm fishing all the time, going out to sea, taking the boat out, catching salmon, you know, and catching halibut and filling up the freezer, right? And then the fall, that's when I'm preparing for winter, the final ends. You know, that's when I go out hunting, because I go moose hunting and caribou hunting and sheep hunting and deer hunting over on Kodiak, you know, and bear hunting, you know, and get the blueberry bears when they're up in the mountains, and they're the best tasting because they've been eating blueberries. And so I go get blueberry bears, and plus you get the hide. I mean, I get lots of stuff off of bear. I get the skull, I get the claws, I get the intestines. You use them just like you use them from a pig, and you use them to make sausages and stuff like that. And then you got the meat from the blueberry bear, which is the best tasting. I mean, even to the point that when you open them up and you see the fat's got a blue tint to it because they've been eating so many berries. And man, when that goes into the food, into the meat that you cook, it's incredible. But that's the thing about it. And we shoot them in the fall because we hang them in the fall, which means that you've got your natural refrigeration room in order to let the meat age and let it hang and cool off, and then you do the cutting and the trimming and the packaging, and then you put them in the freezer and you eat that throughout the year, right? So that's the time when we have the harvesting, and that's also, you know, pick the blueberries. You're picking the blueberries, you're picking the salmon berries, you know, in your area. You pick whatever you are in the fall, right? And then you also do your pickling, and you're doing your preservation. You know, really good for your gut is to do kimchi, you know, make your own kimchi or make your own sauerkraut. That's really good for your gut because, you know, you really digest food not on the actual breakdown of the stomach, by the stomach juices, the acids. You do it by the actual bacteria that's inside your gut that transforms the food into the nutrients that your body absorbs and then is, you know, is strengthened by, and enables you to be healthier as you go into winter, when you could possibly get some really bad diseases like the flu, and now we've got the COVID, right? And then you're back into winter and bunkering in. You know, you made sure that you got all your wood bucked and split and it's all stacked, and all you have to do is just go out, get it, bring it in, and you can keep the stove going all winter, right? And now you're living off the foods that you've collected earlier. You know, you keep bringing the fires going, you know, and this is also the time of death. This is when things die. Winter dies, you know, it's when certain animals die in winter. If you get a big die-off of deer, you know, this is the thing. And then it's also a time when you're cutting trees down, so you're killing trees, and you're logging the trees, and you're pulling the trees. And this is going to be next spring's firewood, or it's going to be what you're going to be building, you know, your homes with in the future. So this is this cycle, and we have to be in this frame of mind. The issue, though, that we have in this culture right now is we've gotten so far away, and this is the thing. It's just like I hear these people talking about things like, oh, you know, here, oh, it's gonna all be better. You know, like it's like they're gonna keep on going up and up and up this climbing mountain that was happening in the previous cycle, but that's not how it works. It's like you go up, and you actually reach the summit. When you reach the summit, then you have to come down. The question is, do you come down comfortably and not so painfully, or do you reach a precipice and you fall over? And then whatever ends up happening is Humpty Dumpty down at the bottom and tries to collect itself back. What will that be? And I'd rather take, like, you know, the gentle slope down instead of just freaking fall off the cliff and get smacked around on the bottom, right? But that's the issue, and these are the modern cultural issues as we deal with seasons of a nation, and that is fewer people connected to the natural world. As I've said, it's like we have gotten so far away to the point that, you know, people are so distant, they're so disconnected from their food that kids actually think, little kids actually think that when they look at a chicken or a steak that's wrapped in cellophane on a shelf, you know, in the refrigeration unit at the supermarket, that's actually where meat comes from. That it actually comes from a machine that just, you know, shoots it out and lays it down, and that's where they get their food from. They don't have the experience which used to be available to kids, where either they lived on a farm themselves or a ranch themselves, and they saw their family go through the process of slaughtering the animals, drawing the animal, you know, cleaning out the intestines, saving various parts like chicken livers and chicken heart and stuff like that, which actually there's a lot of nutrients in there. And it's interesting that our diets have changed so far and away from that we only eat the meat. But if you talk to your grandparents and your great-grandparents, they all say that because that's where you got your vitamins. You couldn't just go buy a capsule and get your vitamins that way. You got your vitamins off the organs themselves, right? And this is going to be the major issue is urban majorities will be the most hit, because what's happened? We've been so successful of getting people to go into cities and get into cities in order to find jobs and be employed and live a lifestyle. But, you know, you're living in an apartment, you're living in a studio. Do you actually own that studio? Do you actually own that apartment? Do you own the house? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. A lot of people don't. And you have this house, and what kind of land do you have? Does your land provide you? Remember, the lawn is a post-war modernity, right? It is supposed to show how much more affluent you are than your neighbor. Because while the other person, the neighbor, has to keep his garden going because that's another extra food source, you're rich enough that you can actually have a lawn instead. That's going to go away. And if it doesn't go away, there are going to be people who are not going to be eating well. A lot of people aren't eating well already because you're getting so much processed food, right? And this is the wild part. Is it's like, again, part of the modern cultural issues. And I'm talking about the last 30 years. Because when I went to high school, and even when I was in middle school or junior high, we had something called home ec, right? Home economics. And I say here, yeah, boys took shop and girls took home economics. Well, actually, you know, depending on what school you went to, boys took home economics too, because if you didn't have home economics, you'd either have to live with your mom until you got married so that your wife could cook for you, or you're eating out all the time, so that means you had to be making a lot of money to be able to go and eat out. And this is the thing about it. People don't realize what's happening is that all this stuff about like going to McDonald's and Burger King and all that kind of stuff, as I was mentioning the prices of food, I talk with friends and says, do you remember when we were kids? And it's just like, I remember when we'd come back from Southeast Asia and we go visit my grandparents and my family in Spokane. And so it was a special deal. We'd go to A&W. You know, we'd go to A&W and we get a Papa Burger. You know, my favorite was a Papa Burger. You know, you could get a Mama Burger, you know, just a little bit smaller. But those burgers were pretty big. But, you know, I was a little kid, so probably it was even bigger than it was for me now. But it was a special event. So maybe like once a week, it was a special drive coming back from like fishing at Loon Lake or Medicine Lake, you know, outside of Spokane. Come back from trout fishing, you know, experiencing the American experience, you know, because when you're raised overseas as an expat, you know, it's like that's your only opportunity to live the American experience. And it was such a special event. In that whole time that we spent, like maybe we spent like 3 weeks or a month with my grandparents in Spokane before we went back. And we only were able to do that every 2 years, right? it was wild because it's like that. We also, like, during that whole time, we went to the restaurant once. And contrast that with now, where it's just like people automatically, I don't want to cook. I'll just go to the restaurant. Or I'll go to, McDonald's and go get something, get some food there. That was a rarity before. And what you're going to see happening as it gets to the point where people realize, geez, I could save a lot more money if I could cook at home. The problem is a lot of people don't know how to cook. They never got it from their mom. They never got it from their dad. They never even got it from their own school where they teach, they used to teach economics. That was taught as a survival skill, not just, it's nice to know. Kind of like the same with shop. I mean, how many people know how to weld? How many people know how to cut a piece of wood? You don't know how to do that, you can't even build a shelter, right? So, the fourth turning in the fourth season of the U.S. So the first turning, okay, we're talking about the first turning is the high, 46.64. That's the spring. Second turning again. Going over this with the awakening was 64 to 84. Those are the 2 points we're talking about in this first part. And the second part we'll talk about the unraveling and also the crises. Okay, those are the third and fourth turnings. So this is the key, 46 to 64. This is the environment my father went into when he graduated university after he came back from Korea. So, it was like the common mind, gung-ho, a lot of that gung-ho mentality. The Marine Corps, gung-ho means work together. The Marines, when they were fighting in China, they picked up that, they're fighting along. At that time, they were fighting alongside the communist Chinese against the Japanese when they picked up that terminology, the gung-ho. But there was also, when I was a kid, I always had like a JFK haircut. The high and tight is actually like a Navy reg, which I had all my life as a kid. That's why when I started growing long hair is because, like, hey, I could grow long hair. But ask not what you can do for your country, but ask not what you can do for your country, right? Actually, it was asked long before, which is ask what you can do. Ask what you can do for your country. That's what's really important here, And that is a typo that I'm going to fix right now at this very moment. Oop, let's get back there. And that's the change that's happened, in this country. It's now, ask not what you, yeah. That's funny. That's what it's become. And then, it's funny, that must have been I was talking about the future, because that's what it's become, right? It's ask what your country can do for you. Okay. That's not what your country can do for you. Okay. And it was asked a long time before before Kennedy. And that's the thing about it, is that, like, people, are forgetting that, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And that is the way it changed, and that's why 64 is so important. We had the event of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and by that event happening, what happened was it closed off that type of idealism that was created during the war. And this is one of the things that's really important for people to realize, and that's why when I listen to Brett Weinstein and his wife Heather Heyer, these were the two that were over there at the, Evergreen. So they're always being interviewed about Evergreen, but I'm like listening to them, and it's just like they're still coming from the point of view of the education institution. They're disconnected from the reality, which is, why did you have such a unification of Americans to get things done? The common mind, the gung-ho, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, right? It was because of actually two things. One is we had a melting pot, a real melting pot. And yeah, on one level, it got to an extreme where it was like, don't speak German, don't speak Italian, don't speak Spanish, you know, only speak English. And I got a bit of that because my first language was Spanish. My mother could not speak English well enough to communicate with me commonly in English. So she spoke Spanish to me. But one of the things she vividly told me was my father telling her, don't speak Spanish to the boy, speak English because he's an American, right? Sad thing about it is that's done to a lot of people who come as, you know, first generation, whatever American. And we'll talk about that too, because that's one of the issues that I have. Okay, quote, I'm Scots American, I'm Spanish American, or actually I'm Hispanic American, Scottish American, German American, Swiss American. The thing about it is, that wasn't used before, you know, or African American, or Asian American, or, you know, Vietnamese American, Chinese American. It used to be American of Chinese descent, American of Scottish descent, American of South American descent or Ecuadorian descent, right? That's the way the terminology was. But by making it a hyphenation the other way in this manner, which is like, oh, I'll say Hispanic American, that has created the division where it's no longer the melting pot. And that's why you have people flying flags as though it were the American flag, which is the only flag that should be flown if you're an American. Because your nationality is what that flag represents, right? And that's where we've got this division. And this is what blows me away, because Weinstein's got this program, the Dark Horse. And it's like, well, this is what's going to bring the country together. But see, again, it's the missing of what happened. First, melting pot. But what happened before World War II? The draft. And what did we get rid of in 1975? The draft. People do not actively come in to a large, big, giant mass of identity. It always comes down to tribal. We are a tribal species. This is how we formed. We formed through tribes. And then we got one tribe to connect with another tribe. And then another tribe and that's the evolution of our society, is we go from a tribe to another tribe to another tribe. What's happened is we've gone back the other way, right? But change is uncomfortable. And think about it. How'd you like to be 18, 17 years old and it's like, oh my God, I got to go in the military and I'm going to be like told what to do and I got to go to boot camp and I got to do all this crap. And it sucks, right? And get your hair cut and do PT and all this kind of stuff. Even more so than you ever thought you'd ever do in high school, right? But they're prepping you in high school for this. But the thing that happens when you go into the military, it enables you to actually deal with people that you do not have prior experience with, either because, let's say, they're from another culture or ethnicity, or they also come from a different class. And this is the difference between Vietnam and World War II, is a lot of guys got out of it by going on a deferment because mommy and daddy could pay for it, right? That was Vietnam. World War II, yeah, that still happened. That's kind of like, you know, why FDR's kid, he automatically became an officer and didn't have to go to war. And I stayed around home at D.C. And then you compare that with others during Korea and who went in the military, and they could have, like my dad told me about a friend of his who came from a very, very wealthy family, and they were all volunteers in the Marine Corps. And that was all about how they were put into a situation where you're in boot camp, you have to be together, you have to do things together. And that is what's lacking in this society. That's what's lacking in what, at one point, you got this Dark Horse program that they're trying to bring together, yet they're totally negating the fact that the reason people were able to go gung-ho and work together in the high was because they came out. This was the GI generation that won World War II. This was the same mentality. It's like, we won World War II, and now we're going to make it a whole different world so that hopefully our children will not have to go through this. Surprise, surprise. Some did and some didn't. But then, so in this high, you have the post-war lawns that I had talked about. That is what happened then, and that's what started. That is totally contrary to what it was before, where you had either victory gardens, during World War II, where people were growing their own veggies. Because remember, there were no supermarkets. And if there were supermarkets, as happened early, like in the 50s and 60s, yeah, the supermarkets started coming, but those supermarkets were very localized. They weren't across the country, and they definitely weren't across the world. I mean, like Walmart and all these others, no way. Those are all indicative of the affluence that had been created. And this is the wild part. Think about it. We have been living over the last 70, 75 years on tracks that were laid by that generation, the GI generation, and the silent generation, which was my dad's generation. Okay, he was born in 1930. So those two generations created what we've been benefiting from all this time period, right? So this is really, really important to see. And that's where you see that the tracks have been laid, and the way I describe it is, we're on the train, the tracks end, and when those tracks end, the train is going to completely come off the track. We are just coming up off the tracks, okay? And let's look at past highs. You know, what, 1497? 1497 to 1517, the Tudor Renaissance, because we're going back into English history, which is actually what set up U.S. history. And that's the thing. It's like, we like to say, oh, well, other countries are involved. Yeah, but they weren't the ones who created the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution were written by WASPs, right? Okay. So 1594 to 1621, that was another high. Merry old England, you know, that was the New World Seculum, right? And then the other one, 1704 to 1727, the Augustan Age of Empire, the Revolutionary Seculum. And then we got 1794 to 1822, the Era of Good Feelings. That's when we've got our Good Feelings, Civil War getting ready to come into it. And then we get into the Great Power. Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, 1865 and 1886. Okay, past highs. Talking again, this is the melting pot. This is the stuff that I was raised with as a child. You know, we're all into this together. It was still left over. And I'm part of what they, in this book, they call the 13ers. You know, it's not a boomer, not old enough to be a boomer, but still having that influence. And we had this melting pot. That melting pot is not that we have such division and separation, and that individualism came about during the awakening, okay? Again, going back to the GI generation, think about what it took for these men and women to work together, no matter where they came from, and to be forced to working together. Or you went in the brig, right? And what did they achieve as a result of that? But it was not comfortable. Going to boot camp, going in the military, going into combat, and then coming back from that. So by the time they came back, it says, anything after this and having survived it, we can make this happen, right? And this is what they envisioned. How many people, well, I don't remember because I wasn't old enough to have heard this, but I heard it from my dad. And my dad told me, yeah, Dwight D. Eisenhower, he was promising everybody a 3-day work week and a house for everyone. Yeah, and they worked towards that, trying to get that. And it's, you know, basically following the idea of the Keynesian economics. And we've reached the point. So that was followed up. It was designed pre-World War II, under Maynard Keynes, and then we get into where it was actually applied. So remember, what is being thought of and philosophized about and theorized about now is what's going to be happening after the closure of the crises. When we come back from the ashes and wipe ourselves off of those ashes and start replanting like a spring, right? And look what happened. The major industry that was created, vehicles, burning gas, drilling, all these things happened within that time period and were set up during that time period. And what's really interesting is about this time, you know, you've got, and this was also when you had corporate food production. That's when you started seeing food being taken out of being raised on your own property and being produced outside. So the corporations were taking care of this. That's actually when you got things happening like with GMO design and Monsanto. That's where this all had its kernel of creation, right? But think about that. We have this plethora of all these things that are available. You didn't have to kill the animal. You didn't have to feed the animal. You didn't have to protect the animal from predators. I mean, I live on a freaking homestead. I've got brown bears that come down and they could eat my geese. I've got wolves that could run through here. I got wild dogs that people freaking just let go that could actually, one attacked one of my geese and broke its wing. Okay? We shoot these things. We do that to protect, and also it's more food you put in the, like, especially with the bears. You know? That's life. That's real life. Killing, planting, harvesting, catching, preserving. That was all taken away by Denny's and going down to Denny's and Big Boys and all these places that were providing all this easy food. This was all the stuff they were dreaming about when they were in the trenches of Europe and in the freaking foxholes in the Pacific. Think about that, all right? And here's my dad. You know where this picture is taken? This is like 1969. I think this is 1969 in Saigon. So we'd been there since Tet Offensive, 1968. So it's Christmas time. And my dad's always got his own little thermos, you know, for work. He worked as a sales engineer. At that time, I think he was still working for Philco Ford. He by that time, he was already working for Amtrak, American Trading Company. One of those companies that disappeared at the end of the Vietnam War. But this is the thing. And I see all this stuff about buy American, buy American. That's not how you make your country great in terms of the economy, right? You make your economy great by producing American and selling overseas. That's what my dad's job was. Pretty much all his professional life. Like Philco Ford, Amtrak, when he was the director of Asia Pacific Rim for Kohler International, right? Out of Wisconsin, out of Sheboygan, out of Kohler, Wisconsin. Well, that time, produced in the United States, an American company, and salespeople, sales reps went overseas and sold to countries. The Philippines, my dad had his area of sales and marketing was Hawaii to Iran, to New Zealand, to Taiwan, Korea, right? In the free world. And then later, you know, towards his retirement, he started selling to the Chinese. He worked for a company that produced cable testers. So, you know, the old sea landlines that go underground or go undersea. Well, you got a big giant cable, goes on the ship. Before you put that thing underwater, you want to make sure that every one of those little wires works, right? So this cable tester would test each one of those little wires for a telephone line. And the key was it was made in the San Francisco Bay area, in the East Bay, and it was sold to the Chinese, and the Chinese bought it. So that is economy, money coming into the United States on a product produced in the United States and sold over. Contrast that to where we are now, which is it's an American company, it's produced in China, and Americans are buying it. So where's the money going? It's not coming to the American company. It's not going to be taxed through the American company. It's going to China. So we're sending money, and that's why China has been getting so much cash from us, is because we've been the customer of our own companies that aren't even enabling us to even produce in our own country, right? Because it's so much cheaper to do over there. So what's the business model? And that's the reason these guys who own these companies are so excited about keeping us on a global economy, on a global politique, where we're relying on all these countries to think about it for our own medicine. And so all they have to do is tell us, oh, well, we're not going to send you the initial ingredients that you need for your own medicine. So it's like you're kind of like our hostage. That's where we've arrived. It wasn't like that before. During the creation of our wealth in the United States, it was because of having production in the United States, selling to foreign customers, and produced and owned by American companies. And that's what we need to get back to. And that's what we're probably going to get back to. And along those lines, I'm talking about what they're really going to be needing around the world, and here in the United States too, is food. And you notice that with the prices of everything that's happening. Okay. Now, this is really important to understand too. This was the way the pyramid was set up. U.S. government, small. Corporations, a little bit bigger. And citizens, the base. And it was the citizens who were basically, in a way, either through their actions of purchase and aligning with corporations, would dictate the market, right? So the market then would be slightly administrated by the government, enabling you. Because remember, the government is only supposed to be there to enable you to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. The government is not supposed to be there to give it to you. But now, and we'll talk about that in the second part, the government is being expected to give that to you too. Where is that going to come from? Ugh. Yeah. But this is what made America great, was small government, and then under that was corporations, and under that was the citizen, and it was the citizens. We, the citizens, were the base on which we made the world. We created the world. The citizens did. Corporations found out how best to do that, and the U.S. government found ways to make sure that everything was bountiful, okay, but did not give you the bounty. Big difference. Okay, so then we got to the second turning, and that's where we get to that, and that is the assassination of a GI generation leader, that's JFK, ends the high in 1963. The trauma events often lead to self-awareness and questioning. Anybody, I mean, I was a counselor, specialty in PTSD. I helped people deal with combat-related PTSD when I was a drug and alcohol rehab counselor for the Friendship House Association of American Indians in San Francisco. And one of the things you're really aware of, you know, self-awareness comes out mainly because there was a traumatic event. You know, for a lot of people in the 60s, the traumatic event was like, oh my God, this is the real world, and I'm no longer being, you know, pampered by my mom and dad who were like taking care of me and wanted the best for me because they didn't want me to go through what they went through in the 30s, right? Okay. But on a deeper traumatic event for the whole nation, the traumatic event was to see someone of the GI generation being assassinated. And then what happens is then the kids who had believed in that, you know, those who had gone into the Peace Corps and believed that, you know, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And then that was transferred into, you know, JFK in Berlin going, Ich bin ein Berliner, right? And all that idealism then being revolted against, and that because that was the norm. And then it became more of the looking within and the counterculture, where, you know, the beatniks were the outliers, but then suddenly the hippies became, you know, the accepted movement. You know, to the point that, you know, when I was in high school, people said, hey, you know, why don't you come and try some pot, you know, try some drugs and all kind of stuff. And I was like, why do I want to go and do that? Never really attracted me. You know, it's like I want to like experience my life fully. And that doesn't mean I want to like, you know, disassociate or disconnect. But that origination of where it was cool to be, you know, a stoner, that started in the 60s and carried through into the 70s especially. And then a little bit in the 80s, and then things started to change. And that's when you had revolution on another level. And we'll talk about that for the part 2, which is in 1984. You had basically the born-again Christian movements and all these different religious movements taken in response to what had happened in the 60s and 70s. And it's very interesting because if you look at it, that's also where the Islamist kind of a reborn-again movement in that area, and how that became very militant. Because if you look at Osama bin Laden, he was an indicator of that, because he was quite the partier back when he was a young man. But then we got, and so also we have the civil rights movement. We have the, you know, Martin Luther King, the Black Panthers, and then you've got the Vietnam War, and that's the new GI. So the Vietnam War enables the opportunity for those who weren't able to have gone into World War II. And remember, it's always interesting because every soldier always tries to fight the previous generation's war, right? Or wishes they, because I mean, what got them into? Oh well, you know, mom, you know, dad and Uncle Tom were in World War II, so their kids want to have that experience. So that's why they sign up you know, or when they're drafted, that's what they hope they're going to have experience. But the Vietnam War was not like that for them, unless their father fought in the Pacific, and then it was actually very similar. But it's interesting that there's a very strong separation between that. Basically, well, you know, you don't know what my war was like, and I don't know what your war was like, and we have different wars. But then if you talk and you really look at the events that happened, you go, wow, God, that was pretty similar to what happened to me, except I was in a totally different part of the world, right? Yeah, okay. So then you had like the Vietnam War protests, and you had the Weather Underground. And see, that's actually where you get the polarity right now. The Weather Underground is like the Bolsheviks in Russia. And that's what we've got right now. The Weather Underground, all those who are revolting, Antifa, those are our Bolsheviks for our generation, for this time, and this period in the United States and around the world, because it's not just a U.S. thing. Then you have the hippies, the Buddhism, the Muslims, spiritual awakening, you know, like freaking Cat Stevens, you know, finding himself as a Muslim, you know, and the Summer of Love, free love. You also had feminism versus suffragism. You know, that's when you had feminism, and it was also the finding of self. But then by the 70s, it really got polarized in terms of how it was being thought of, and it was actually different from suffragism, suffragism is it was the previous cycle. So then you have these evolutions. Remember, it goes around and around and around, and so you've got this where you've got this flip over from feminism into suffragism. I mean, from suffragism into feminism. And then so past awakening. So let's look at these, like 1621 to 1649, the Puritan awakening. That's about the time that my ancestors, yeah, Andrew Fuller, his son Samuel, my direct ancestor under my great-great-grandmother. My great-grandmother, yeah, Wara Bonham. So her relations back, I guess, married Samuel Fuller, who was a kid on the Mayflower. And that was a time that defined what the United States was, which is a puritanical. And it's very interesting because as you read George Friedman's book also, he has a pretty good take on it, how it was always the corporations involved. So it was the corporation back in Holland who invested in the ship and enable the Pilgrims, the Puritans, to go to Plymouth Rock, right? But it was during that time of radical Protestantism, and the Protestant fervor, which was also marked, you know, with Cromwell. If you ever get a chance, it's on Amazon Prime right now. Watch Cromwell with Sir Richard Harris. Very good movie. It also talks, you know, with Charles I. That sets up what America is in contrast to South America. He has a really good take on why South America, first of all, was never able to unify in the way that, say, like Canada and the United States were. That each one of what should have been states or provinces ended up being countries, like Argentina, Ecuador, Colombia, etc. And how Simon Bolivar was like, he died in poverty, and he also died in dismay and depression because he was never able to achieve what he thought that George Washington had been able to do. But see, it's because of the intent of how the Spanish came to South America and Central America and Mexico, in contrast to how the British immigration occurred, which was more of a religious freedom and farming, agricultural intent, as compared to gold and slaves from the South for the Spanish, right? Okay. So then we get in the Great Awakening. That's 1727, 1746. We got an evangelical revivals. And this is really interesting because that's actually what leads to the shot heard around the world, which is, you know, it's the evangelical, which is the idea that a common man could be at the same spiritual level and awareness as a royal. Because remember, it was always the king is a continuation or the touch of God. Because if you were to be commanded by the king, you are being commanded by God, right? Because God is supposed to come through the monarch. That changed between 1727 and 1746, and really, you know, under George Whitefield, and created the It removed the old world ideas of class distinction from a social solidarity on American soil, and that's where it became "we are Americans," as compared to British, and the English would call it colonials. We're colonials, but Americans are calling ourselves Americans. So we might be colonials, but within that we're Americans, right? And then that is what led to the Battle of Concord, in the same way that we've got all these events that are happening as a result of what happened in the 60s, right? And then you also had in 1822 to 1844 transcendental awakening, kind of like Walt Whitman, all these type of artists and writers and that kind of stuff that started appearing. And then we get to 1886, so we're after the Civil War. So there were the previous 20 years, right? So Civil War, beginning of the big high, and then we have the past awake was 1886 to 1908, and we have the Third Great Awakening. We got the Workers' Revival. We got the evangelism and the feminism, the New Woman. This began then. Okay, this is actually when women started smoking cigars and cigarettes. That act, because only men were allowed in society to do that, that's what changed things for everybody, right? And then we get into 64, 84. Things that had happened between 86 and 1908 previously, now it's come back, and it's coming back fuller and more refined and with more energy to it, right? Okay. And that's what we got, like the consciousness revolution, the awakening, you know, all these hippies, all these people who were in college, who went from college to becoming professors, and then those they taught, then creating the institutions that we have now in the education systems. Pretty wild. So it's all destined. So this is all to set you up to look at these things. In the next episode, 25, we're going to get into it deep. And when we get into it deep, let me tell you, it's a humdinger. Because I'll take you through the last fourth turning, and I'll show you exactly how all these demonstrations, all these, quote, protests that are not protests anymore, now they're just into demonstrations and riots. These are just like the Bolsheviks in Russia. These are just like the communists in the 1930s. This is like the racial protests and riots in Chicago in the 1930s, and even back, you know, right after World War I. There are presets to this, right? We are looking at this and telling that there's a situation. Man, you hear that sensor going off? I got a moose out there on the deck. Anyway, so I'm gonna probably have to shoo it off. But the third turning, the unraveling, that's gonna be the fall. We've already gone through that. But just to set you up for what we are in, that's the fourth turning, that's the crisis, that's the reset. And this is going to be the reset where we flip into the high. And that's the big question, is where this high is going to be, and I'm going to describe to you how and why. And in the meantime, go over to Amazon.com, check out my books. I got a few books, and I'm going to have a few more books up there pretty soon. So check out, if you want to understand what's happening with the media and why we're so screwed up and screwed by what the media is doing to us, go get my book, So You Want to Be a Reality TV Star. That's very poignant to what's happening right now, because I don't just write about me being on this reality TV show that was #1 2015 for Discovery as a new hit series. No, it's the idea of how they play with your minds by telling you things that are not true, and how they control the media in order to achieve their ends, which for the corporation is just to make money for their board of directors and their stockholders, which, man, if I had Discovery stock right now, I'd be ditching it. I wouldn't want to risk having it in there. I'd be putting it into gold, let me tell you. And when I say gold, I don't talk about like, oh, owning paper. Like, oh, well, I've got like shares, you know, with this company that's got my gold for me. No. You need to own gold like you got it in your hand, right? And then, oh, yeah, so make them pay. That's a good one for you people who want to understand, like, what's happening and how to understand what's an insurgency, what's a counterinsurgency, what's occurring. And then if you want to look at my background and how I got on this road, go check out The Bamboo Chest. It's in its second edition. It was an international bestseller back in 2004. And that talks about what's it like to be in a communist prison. Because let me tell you, I hope to God we don't go communist in this big high. Because the big high is not necessarily about like, wow, things are going to be great. It's just that it's going to be new. Remember that. The big high could be anything. It could be something great, which was 1946 to 64, that we've actually been living off that wealth and affluence that was created between 1946 and 1964. Or it could be this major hell, which is we are now reporting to a Politburo and we have a commissar in charge. And it's like, what, 1925, 1928, and we've got not the CIA and the FBI, but we've got our own NKVD. And they're telling us what to do. You know, they're also telling us what to do already. So you should be concerned about that. Remember, we'll look at that pyramid again in part 2. The one that's got U.S. government, small corporations, a little bit bigger above that. And then big is the citizens, right? Well, we'll look at that pyramid and see how it's cattywamping. But check out my books. Go pick up a copy. And be sure to subscribe right now if you haven't already subscribed over at YouTube at my channel, which is Treasure Quest Snake Island, The Real Story. And man, when you read that book, So You Want to Be a Reality TV Star, that tells you how the media is playing you because they can. And that's what blows me away. The FCC, the FTC, they should be putting their hammer down on this, but not a word. Don't worry about who's paid off by who, right? Okay. And go check out and pick up a copy of 5 Acres in Independence, because that's actually the book that I read 20 years ago. When I read that book, that's why I live in the country. I live rurally. I subsistence hunt and fish. I raise my own chickens, raise my own geese, and got apples and blueberries and haskcaps. That's Siberian honeyberries. And what else got grown? Oh, cabbage and lettuce and bok choy and Chinese garlic chives and all the stuff I like to cook with, right? That's because I wanted to be on land that I could self-support. And if you're paying attention to the prices, and if you're paying attention to the shortages, and if you're paying attention to what's happening over in China, where that's the reason they bought Smithfields, read 5 Acres in Independence. That book came out in 1941, and it was written by, M.G. Keynes. Man, that moose is just hitting the alarm. And a handbook for small farm management. This edition that's available now, that was actually published by the USDA. The good USDA that's trying to make sure that you can grow your own food, because if you can't buy it in the supermarkets because of either change in the weather or all this other stuff that's happening, it's good to be able to know that you can actually grow your own food at home. That's if you got the land. If you don't got the land, make the land or go get the land. Or connect up with someone else that you can purchase together the land. And also go over to my website at corkgraham.com. That's the one that you see right up above, globalcounterdare.com. And I will have a page at corkgraham.com/thrive. And there will be a assist. It'll be an operational plan for you to make sure that you're getting ready if you haven't already gotten ready. And I'll have that up in the next 2 days. And it's in order to help you get set up so that you can do what I am doing, which is to get ready for what's happening. And let me tell you, it's happening. You're seeing it. And there's some issues related to denialism. We'll go into the definition of denialism. It's the same stuff, that the Jews in the United States were dealing with when they were thinking, oh, don't worry about, Uncle Bob or, Robert or Roberto. He's okay. They're just putting him on the trains and they're taking him into, to the work camps. That's what the Nazis were doing. And a lot of Jews in America were ignoring that, thinking, oh, it's not that bad. They can't be doing that, even though they're hearing all this stuff. That's denialism. It's like looking at what's happening in our country, looking at what's happening in the world and thinking, no, that can't happen again, can it? It's not that it can happen. It's the idea of understanding that it is happening and how best for you personally to respond to it. Because think about this. You can't ask your government to do things for you that can only best be done by you. We've become a society that we rely so much on the government to do things for us that it's almost like Babe in the Woods. And here you are, and the wolves are prowling, the big grizzly bears are hungry, and you're like Mowgli, and there's nobody there to adopt you. So it's time to grow up, wake up, and get ready, and get going, and realize you got to take care of this yourself, because if you don't take care of this yourself, soon there might not be anybody there to take care of it for you. And we talked a little bit about that with fiat currency. Remember what happened with the Reichstag and how that became the Nazi government and the National German Workers' Party, Socialist Workers' Party, and how they took over and why they took over. Basically because the government wasn't taking care of things. Same thing happened in Nicaragua. What happened? Somoza wasn't taking care of things. People weren't feeling safe. Sandinistas took that as an opportunity, came in, and boom, Somoza's jumping on a plane, running for Argentina. And then he gets assassinated by the Montoneros. We'll talk about that in the next part. So get a copy if you haven't already picked up a copy of The Fourth Turning, An American Prophecy by William Strauss and Neil Howe over at Amazon also. And again, subscribe at YouTube, like and share. And also, I will have links directly to all these books and all these pages for you to just click on them. They'll be in the commentary of this episode right here, and also the next episode, part 2, where we talk about the third turning and the fourth turning. And all I can say is good night and good luck.